questions or remarks before I start? No? Sir?
Yeah, on the homework, when we're trying to syllabify the fake words or whatever, I had a question about, you know how the ol can be a nucleus sometimes?
Right.
So I found that word was very similar to the word tackle.
Yes.
So it confused me. So
yes.
Only obviously when it has the mark, but just because you didn't put the mark means that you can't do it.
Right. So this is a question about the homework that came in today. One of those what was it, 5 words I gave you, or 4 words? Fake words that I gave you was transcribed with these sounds in it. Ta, ah, k, and ul. Okay? And your task was to find of those 4 words the word that was possible and tell me why the other 3 weren't possible. This word was one of those that wasn't possible. And what's a little confusing about that is that when you put those sounds together, there is a way of pronouncing it that is possible. Namely, that way is tackle, where the ka and the ul at the end of that word form their own syllable, kol. So those phones could go together to make a 2-syllable word that would be legitimate. The last syllable in the pronunciation of that word, tackle, would be like the last syllable in spittle. Okay? But if that is the pronunciation of that word, that last L would have been transcribed with a little line under it saying, oh, this L is a nucleus of a syllable. Without that little line under it, that L has to be pronounced as part of the coda that ends a 1-syllable word in this instance. So the pronunciation of that word would have to have been takla. And my guess is that English speakers won't hear that as a possible word because kla isn't a possible coda. Okay, so that's how I was thinking that word would go together. It wouldn't be possible because what I transcribed wasn't tackle, but takla, and consequently the coda in takla, having kla in it, is bad. So that's how I was thinking about that. What did we decide to do about that? Did we just...
We decided it's okay.
Yeah. So, I make these homework assignments and I also determine how they are graded. In fact, I do, I hold all the power. I'm just a power-hungry capitalist pig is what I am. And, I'm actually just a pig, okay? And, but the TAs rallied and said to me in our meeting, look, that's just too tricky for words. And so if you decided that word, takla, was actually tackle, and showed me that that's how it could be syllabified, the TAs decided that we shouldn't take any points off. It was just too hard a word to sort of figure out somehow. Okay? Yeah, so that was a little tricky, too tricky. Yeah. Anything else? No questions? Okay, so what we've been doing is taking a look at those rules that are responsible for giving the pronunciation of words. The first rule we looked at was the rule that syllabifies words, that assigns all the phones in a word a particular position in a syllable, and that's what this question that we've just been discussing was about. And then we've also seen that there are rules, in addition to those, that actually change the sounds that make up a word themselves. The terminology we have for that is there are rules that convert the phonemes, the sounds that make up words, into their allophones, the variants of those phonemes, the styles of pronunciation, the things that make it sound like you have the proper accent, the accent that goes with the language that has these rules. So we started looking at that problem by observing that English has a rule that makes voiceless stops aspirated in a certain place, beginnings of onsets. And then I showed you another rule last time found in German, and I just want to remind you about that rule here. So here are the words in German that we looked at, and I asked you to consider the two German fricatives here, h and he, and compare them. And we discovered when we did that there was evidence that these two sounds, one is an allophone of the other. That evidence consists in noticing that, like the aspirated voiceless stops of English, this sound is only found in a certain place after back vowels, oo, o, or ah. If we looked at loads and loads of German words, you would notice that trend. The only place that ha, this sound, shows up is after oo, o, and ah, which, as it happens, are all of the vowels in German that are back, that are produced by bringing the tongue back in the throat. Okay. And hier shows up everywhere else. After front vowels, after mid vowels, after consonants, after silence. Okay. And we get a little bit of a taste of that by looking at this rather short list of words from German. Ha is found after these back vowels. Hier is found after e, after o, after de, after a, after silence. If we looked long enough, we would see it can be found after every other sound in German, just not oo, o, or ah. Okay. And that is a sign, just like finding aspirated stops only at the beginnings of onsets is in English, that that sound, ha, is an allophone of the thing that's not found in that position, hia. Okay? All right? Well, this is the setup. So what it seems to be is that in German, words are always constructed with h. But there's a rule that turns some of these h's into h. The h's that follow back vowels. So not this one, but this one and this one. Okay. So the setup in German is that Germans have learned these words. They think all those words are composed of this sound h, but out of their mouths pops instead h sometimes. The sometimes being when there's a back vowel right before it. Okay. All right. Okay, so that's what we're studying, these rules of allophony. I don't know, do you find this confusing? Is it hard? I think this is the hardest thing in the class. That's what I think. Because this is what I failed this class because of, the first time I took it. Yeah, that's probably why it's still the hardest thing, because the guy who got an F is now teaching this damn stuff. I think probably the best thing to do, my strategy about this is let's just do it over and over again until the details fall in place. Because what I want you to be able to do is look at a list of words from some language and, like we did for German here, deduce which sounds are allophones of other sounds. That deduction will come by finding where these sounds are in words, what they can stand next to, and noticing that one of them or one group of them can't stand next to something that the other one or the other group can. Okay. So that's the rule we ended up with. And when you do this, what I want you to do is, when you discover a rule of allophony like this, a rule that changes a phoneme into its allophone somewhere, I want you to write that rule always in the same kind of way, like this. Okay? So I want you to write the rule so that you say, when something stands next to something else, then it changes to X. Okay? Just like here, this rule says, when a back vowel stands right before h, h becomes ch. Okay? We're going to be a little bit more specific about writing this rule in a moment. I'm going to teach you something about the information that these rules make use of, these phonological features that I mentioned last time. But this is the format I want you to use. It'll make it easier for us to know what you're trying to tell us if you always write your rule that way. So it should always be, start with the word when, then You tell me which thing is standing next to which thing. You have to do the shoulders too. And then you say what changes to what. Okay? So the German rule could be this way. When back vowels precede h, that's a palatal fricative, then h, that's the palatal fricative, becomes velar, a velar fricative. That's what h is. All right, good. Well, let's do another problem. Let's look at another case. This one is Southern Congo. These are words from Southern Congo. You can see that Southern Congo has interesting onsets that we don't have in English. Like, for instance, Nkoshi is a possible onset, Nko, with Nga followed by Ka. Nse, Nselele is a possible onset. Not possible in English, but those Southern Congos can do lots of things. Nzwe, Nzwetu, Jima, Kesoka, and so on. Okay? All right. So, from this word list, we know something. We know, a couple of things. We know something about what sounds actually occur in Southern Congo. In fact, all the sounds we see in these words are sounds that are also found in English. So far, there's no surprises there. We, as I just mentioned, notice that sometimes those sounds can combine into onsets in ways that English doesn't allow, like in the words I just spotted. And now what we should do is ask, well, okay, so if these are sounds of this language, which of them are phonemes, and which of those that we see in these words are really allophones of one of the others of a phoneme? Okay, same kind of problem that we've been looking at. And here what I want to do is ask, unlike what I did for German, where I said, okay, let's ask, is h and h, are they different phonemes in German? Or is one an allophone of the other? And we discovered that h is an allophone of h. I want here to ask not about a pair of sounds, but instead about two kinds of sounds. Okay? So, I want to compare all those sounds which are fricatives made by making the frication at the alveolar ridge to all those sounds in this language which are fricatives made by bringing the tip of the tongue right behind the alveolar ridge. The alveopalatal or post-alveolar, two names that mean the same thing, fricatives. Okay. So what I'm doing when I ask this question is I'm sort of asking a question like I would have asked about English if we were trying to discover whether the voiceless stops and the voiceless aspirated stops were allophones or phonemes. If we were linguists that weren't English speakers, we would have to discover that the pa, tas, and kas, the aspirated pa, tas, and kas, are allophones of the unaspirated pa, tas, and kas. And a way we could discover that is ask not, well, is pa and pa, are they allophones, but are the voiceless stops and the voiceless aspirated stops allophones? Okay, so that's what I'm trying to do here, is ask not about a particular pair of sounds, but a particular class of sounds, or a particular way of making sounds. Ma'am?
Are all of the allophones in English just different because they're aspirated and not aspirated?
No.
What's an example of one that it's a difference between letters and not just aspiration?
Oh, I see. Yeah, because in fact it's true, right? Because that's a good point. Because the sign I use in the IPA to indicate an aspirated voiceless pa, for instance, is just pa with a little raised h. Whereas it's completely different symbols in the case of German, say. Yeah, and it's really just sort of an accident of the designers of the International Phonetic Alphabet that that's the case. So it could have been that, aspirated pa could have been, say, indicated by a sign that didn't have anything to do with lowercase p. It's a stupid accident of the designers of the IPA, a bunch of old men in Europe. Okay. They're in Europe, aren't they? They're men, aren't they? So, but you want me to give you an example of an allophone phoneme in English that actually uses different symbols. I mean, the symbols don't matter somehow. It's the difference in the sounds. Let's see if I can think of one. Can I do voiceless sonorants? Is that okay? Can I do that one? Okay. So, oh, but it doesn't help, does it? It's the same shit. I can't think of one. I mean, one is that some vowels become schwa in unstressed syllables. So I mentioned that last time. That's a slightly more complicated situation than the one we're actually describing here. But that's a similar kind of thing. So there's a rule that makes certain vowels go to schwa when they're unstressed. So that's an example, I'll say. Okay, sorry, yeah. I guess, usually I don't get this far into the class before telling you, I have really no credentials in this area. I'm a total imposter. I'm the only guy who can tie a tie in my department, so that's why they let me teach. There was a hand over here. You know what the funny thing is about you? Is that every time you raise your hand, I can't see you or your hand. All I see are these little fingers right behind this guy's head. So, yeah.
I try to sit behind people shorter than me, but there are very few of those.
Yes, you would be out of luck in this audience. Yeah.
I might be totally off base with this, but isn't there some cases where in a coda that has two consonants, some cases you use N and some cases you use un? Like, wouldn't that be an example?
Yeah, so that's close to an example. So the places where you find nga are very limited in distribution in English. They're always in codas. And if you look at the spelling, usually the places where nga is found are in words that are spelled with ng. Okay, like sing it's not sing, it's sing. Yeah. That's because in Old English, nga was an allophone of na. And in Old English, we are roughly now speaking about the time when the spelling system of English was designed. Now become nga when ga followed. That's used to be a rule of English, and it's sort of preserved in the words that we use in present-day English. So it's kind of like a ghostly allophonic rule. It's another example of the sort you're asking for, though. There was another hand here that I was ignoring. Ma'am. Oh, that's a good one too. Yeah, isn't it? So, for instance, the word that's that refers to the yellow thing that comes in long sticks like this, that you put on your toast in the morning, that word is butter, if you speak it that way. But if you don't, the ta becomes a flap. Ra, butter. Butter. So there's a rule that makes ta, ra in a certain place between vowels.
So that's an allophone?
That's an allophone too. Mm-hmm. I'm sorry, now I've ignored someone here.
I'm not sure if this counts, but at least when I speak, if I'm doing a voiced consonant followed by an S, it becomes a Z.
Yeah.
And when I do an unvoiced consonant, try to do it followed by a Z, it becomes an S.
Yeah, that's a good observation too. So it's generally true that if you, like for instance, if you end a word with duh, and there's a fricative that follows it, that could be sa or za, it'll be za and not sa. Yeah, that's generally true. And actually that rule, which is slightly more complicated than, believe it or not, these simple ones, is one we'll look at next week. Okay. Anything else? Are we ready for Southern Congo? Okay. So what are the alveolar fricatives, ladies and gentlemen? Yeah, sa and za. Sa and za. And what are the post-alveolar fricatives, or the alveopalatal fricatives? Sir?
Sh and ja.
Sh and zh. Okay? So what this question is asking is sa, sha, and also za, zha, are those pairs allophones, or are they phonemes? Are these pairs of sounds phonemes or allophones in English? So is sa and sha different phonemes? Are sha and sa different phonemes in English? Does anyone know? How would you find out? Sir? Yeah, is there a minimal pair in English that distinguishes sa from sha? There is, and what is it? What do you have in mind? You can't think of any. I always think of shit. Yeah, shit and sit are a minimal pair. You know, the thing is that I just never stopped having a 13-year-old sense of humor, which is a liability in a large lecture hall. Okay, and then what about za and zha? Are they phonemes or allophones in English? That's harder. Sir?
Beige and bays.
Beige and bays. How about phage and phase? I think phage is a word.
Like a bacteria phage.
Yeah. Is that ja? Blast. A little harder to find a minimal pair there, but I think they are different phonemes in English. The reason for that is that ja is never found at the beginnings of syllables. It can't be in an onset in English. Okay, well, what should we look for here then? If these pairs of sounds are phonemes, what should we expect to find in southern Congo? We should expect to find shit and sit, right? We should expect to find a minimal pair that distinguishes sa from sha or ja from za. Are there minimal pairs like that here? Ma'am?
Well, before you said that, did you say the ja couldn't begin in a syllable?
I don't think it can be in an onset in English.
That's the example.
Jive?
That's the example that we have on our IPA.
That sound at the beginning of jive is ja. This sound is not ja, though. This is ja, like found in the word measure. Okay? Yeah. It's okay. There are no minimal pairs here. So we've got no evidence from this list of words that sa is a different phoneme from sha in southern Congo, or that za is a different phoneme from ja in southern Congo. Sir?
I think I found a minimal pair for that, for the ja and za. And that's assuming that ja is different from da and ja. Like budge and buds.
Yeah, so budge ends with ja, and bud ends with da. So those would be a minimal pair for da and ja. Ja is one sound. Okay?
Spelled with a D and a
Yeah, one sound. Yeah. But right, I see buds, za would go with the ja part of ja. Yeah, clever.
I think one of the problems we're having here is the difference between ja and ja.
Right.
Which ja is a combination of the D.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So ja we should think of as being one sound, though the way it's pronounced involves articulations that two other sounds have, da and ja. But they combine in a way that makes one sound in the case of ja. All right. Well, no evidence that these are phonemes. So now we need to look and see, is there evidence that sa-za is an allophone of sha-ja, or sha-ja, the other way around, is an allophone of sa-za. So let's turn to that question. And how would we find, what constitutes evidence for that? If there's a rule that turns, let's say, sa and za together into sha and ja, or a rule that turns sha and ja together into sa and za, what would be evidence of that rule? What would we find about these sounds in this language? You guys are just ready for Saturday, aren't you? It's like, what we would find is that we would find one of those sounds in a place where the other one isn't. The place where the rule converts one of those sounds into the other one. And so that's what we need to do. We need to ask, these questions. What are the sounds that can come before sa and za? And let's compare those to the sounds that can come before sha and ja and see if they're ever the same. And then let's do the same thing with what sounds can follow. What sounds can follow sa and za? And let's compare that to the sounds that can follow sha and ja. And do you notice anything about? So if you look at the sounds that come directly after and directly before either sa or za, and you compare those to the sounds that you see coming directly after or directly before either sha or ja, what do you see? Sir?
Well, Z is before every consonant except for I, which Z is in front of.
Okay, so observation. Za is before
And every vowel.
every vowel. So any kind of vowel can follow za. So U can follow za, A can follow za, and A can follow za, but not E. E, ja is followed by, but not za. Okay? And now what about sa and sha? If you compare what can be next to those sounds, do you see anything? Any pattern? Does Saturday start right at 2:30? Is that the... Well, what do you see following sha? E.
Well, it's a similar thing to what he was just saying.
Yeah. And what do you find following ja? E. And do you ever see E following sa or za? Okay, so here's the pattern. The post-alveolar fricatives, sha and ja, are always followed by E, this sound. But sa and za never are followed by E. Okay? So here's what I did. I made a table. I put sa and za in one column, and I put sha and ja in the other column. And I looked to see what sounds, and I just listed them, could come before either one of these. And I looked at what sounds can come after either one of these. Okay. And I did the same for sha and ja. And when I do that, what I see is that coming before sa and za can be silence, or can be na, or can be ah. And those same things can also come before these two. So if there is a rule turning one into the other, it won't be a rule that is sensitive to what kind of sound comes right before. On the other hand, when I look at these columns, I find, well, just what you guys observed, that after these is always this sound E, and after these guys is something else, but never E. Okay. That's what we look for. That's a sign that there's a rule converting one class of sounds into the other. It could be that there's a rule that turns sa, za into these guys. Or it could be that there's a rule that turns sha, ja into these guys. It just depends on which is the phoneme and which is the allophone. Which rule do you think it is? Is it sha, ja goes to sa, za? No. What would that rule have to look like? It would have to say, make these guys turn into these guys whenever a sound that's made in the way that these sounds are made occurs right afterwards. Well, what is it that these guys have in common? What is it that makes these sounds similar? Are they nasal? Are they stops? Are they... A lot of them are vowels, but wa isn't a vowel. But what is wa and a, these two, what do they have in common? They're voiced. Is there anything else they have in common? Really, not a heck of a lot. So, if there were a rule turning these guys into these guys, it would have to say something like, make these guys when something voiced follows. Right? But that rule wouldn't be right, because it would make these guys turn into these guys even when E followed. Because E is voiced too. Are you with me? Okay. So, that's how we know it doesn't go that way. It goes the other way. Sa and also za are the phonemes. But Southern Congo speakers convert those into sha or ja when E is the next thing that's being pronounced. Okay. And now we have to think about how to write that rule. So what we need to do is find, well, what is it that sa and za have that are in common? So we need to find the property that the rule is using to pick out the sounds that are going to be changed. And then we need to say how these sounds are changed so that sa becomes sha and za becomes ja. And then finally we need to find out what is it that makes E, the thing that's making this rule triggered, what is it that makes E different from every other sound? We need to convert this rule into a rule that makes reference to what's going on in our mouths when we make these sounds, rather than what the sounds actually show up as in the IPA. Now here's the setup. All these words have sa and za in them. This rule that we have yet to write turns these guys into sha and ja because E follows. If we went to a Southern Congo speaker and asked them, what's the sound that's in this word? They would say it's sa. Just like if I asked you, what's the sound that's in plate? You would tell me it's pa, when it's actually pa. Now, it turns out, so what we have to do yet is write this rule. We have to find what it is that makes these sounds, what's relevant in producing these sounds that these rules are manipulating. And it turns out that not everything that goes into articulating sounds matters for rules like these. Certain properties do matter, like whether a sound is voiced or not, whether the vocal cords are flapping, or whether a sound is nasal or not, whether the velum is lowered and so air goes into the nose, or whether there's a complete closure in the oral tract or not, whether it's a stop or an affricate, for instance. These things matter, but other things don't matter, like exactly how high a tongue is, or how much saliva is in your mouth when you make these things. Or there are some properties of articulating sounds which languages use to build words. And there are other properties which just aren't used. Okay. So to write this rule, we need to know what are the relevant properties. What are the relevant articulations in making sounds for phonology? And these articulations are called, these articulatory properties are called distinctive features. Okay? So what you need to do now, what I have to teach you now is, well, what are, for each sound, what are the relevant articulatory properties in making it? What are its distinctive features? And you'll find on today's lesson in the web page that you can download a handout that will give you, for all of the sounds that we'll be looking at, the relevant distinctive features. Okay? And in addition, there's a little handout that walks you through those features, describing what they refer to. And that's something I'll do now as well. Okay? So like I said, some of these distinctive features are familiar to you, like voice. Okay? So if a sound is plus voice, if it has that property, which we'll indicate by putting the feature name inside these brackets and indicating that it has it with a plus, then you are a sound for which the vocal folds are flapping, vibrating. All vowels are voiced, for instance. So is m, so is n, so is d, so is z, and so on. Okay? And everything else is minus voice. Okay? So this you've already learned. Some of the features, though, are slightly different than the ones I taught you when I taught you the IPA. And one of those is this feature, this property, continuant. A sound has this property, is continuant, if there is not a complete closure made in the oral tract. So these are sounds which aren't stops or affricates. Those sounds which don't have this property do involve a complete closure in the oral tract, and so they are the stops and affricates. Okay? Are you with me? Gesundheit. Here's another. Labial. This is a property that a sound has if the articulation of that sound involves the lips in any way. So you are plus labial if lips are involved in making you, and you're minus labial otherwise. Okay? So wa and fa, but not ka. Okay. Coronal. Coronal refers to a gesture that involves the blade of the tongue. The blade of the tongue is that part of the tongue that you can get to stick out of your mouth. You're a brave man sitting up here in the front. I spit on you last time, and today I stuck my tongue out. Okay, so those sounds that are plus coronal are sounds that involve using the blade of the tongue. So like la, or ta, or cha, or sa, or well, tha should be in there. And so should the. And everything else is minus coronal. Okay? All right? Using the blade of the tongue, it seems that that's a relevant articulation for rules of the sort that we're learning. Coronal. Anterior. Anterior means front. And so what a sound that is anterior is a sound that's made in the front of the mouth. Front is measured by the alveolar ridge. So anything that's made at the alveolar ridge or forward of that is plus anterior. So pa is, and ba is, and sa is. But sha, which is made by bringing the tip of the tongue right behind the alveolar ridge, is not. Okay, so far so good. So we've got voice, we've got nasal, we've got labial, using the lips. We've got coronal, using the blade of the tongue. What was the other one? Sorry? And continuant. Mm-hmm. Sir?
Could you continuance again?
Yes.
What is actually controlling whether the tongue is controlling?
No. So a continuant sound is one in which there is not a complete closure in the oral tract. So a minus continuant sound is, for instance, pa, there's a complete closure at the lips. Or ka, there's a complete closure by bringing the back of the tongue against the velum. Or na, there's a complete closure by bringing the tongue at the alveolar ridge. These are all minus continuant. And plus continuant are things like and every other vowel, and wa, and sha, and lots of others. Fa, and so on. Did that answer? Okay. Okay. All right. Our next feature is this one, sonorant. Sounds that are, this is a property that has to do not with the articulation of a sound, but rather with its acoustic properties. And it's hard for me to describe what that is without actually showing you something about the physics of these sounds, and I don't want to do it. So I'm just going to have you memorize this. Sonorant sounds are, they're all consonants. I see the problem now. And and they're all voiced, and they're all sounds that are, you know, they're like the sounds you could hum somehow. Oh, is not sonorant. Okay? The only one I'm not so sure about is ooh. I'm not sure you can hum that one. Yes, sir.
Why aren't vowels sonorant?
Vowels could be sonorant too, but I will only use this feature when describing consonants. Yeah. Yeah, I don't know. Is it humming really?
It's like a kazoo.
It's, yeah. So the non-kazoo humming sounds. And the next feature is the kazoo sound, oddly enough. This too is a feature that describes something about the acoustics of the sound and not how it's articulated. It's strident. Strident sounds are sounds that have a high-pitched hissing noise to them. So they are s, z, sh, zh, ch, and zh. Okay. To have a hissing sound, you must be a fricative or an affricate. Okay. The stridents are those hissing sounds, some fricatives or affricates, whose hissing is sort of high in pitch. So, s is one, but is not. Can you say those two sounds and see if you can hear the difference? Believe it or not, there's more energy in the higher frequencies for s than in f. Okay. So here's another way of remembering which sounds are strident. The stridents are every fricative or affricate that does not involve using the lip. That's the list. So fricatives that involve using the lips, fa and va, no. Sorry, scratch that. Just erase that from the tape. That's completely wrong. Let me start over. Here's another easy way. We'll just do this for the camera. Here's another way to remember which sounds are strident. They are all those fricatives and affricates which do not use the teeth. So, and v use the teeth by bringing the lip up to it, and z use the teeth by bringing the tongue close to it. Those aren't strident. All the other affricates and fricatives are. Okay. You have to learn these. Got them? Sonorant, strident, carnal, labial, voiced, nasal, continuant. Oh, but we are not done. Oh, no. We still have to write this rule in terms of these features. So, we have to convert this into the features that only E of all the vowels in this language has. We have to convert these guys into the features that sa and za and none of the other sounds in this language have. And then we have to say how those guys should change to make sha and ja. These sounds are strident. There are no other sounds in southern Congo that are strident. There are other strident sounds, cha, ja, but those sounds aren't in southern Congo so far as we know. These are the only two that are. So our rule will look at those things that are strident. And now, once it's picked out sa and za, the only strident sounds in southern Congo, we must say, what do you do to sa and za to make sha and ja? Well, let's look. Here are the features. Here's sa, za, sha, and ja. We want to turn these guys into these guys. So what do we have to change? How is sa different from sha? Anterior. Sa is made at the alveolar ridge, front of the mouth. Sha is made right behind the alveolar ridge, not front of the mouth. And that is also the only difference between za and ja, as it turns out. So, we will take the stridents, that's just sa and za in southern Congo. We will change their feature value from plus anterior to minus anterior. That will make sa sha and za ja. And we will do that when a high front O, these features, something that isn't a consonant, something that is a vowel. That's what these two features mean. We will do that when a high front vowel follows. I'm so sorry. Have a good weekend.